it is my distinct pleasure, and I don't often say that, but I mean it in this particular situation, to introduce Dr. Bruce Morton, who is here to talk to us today about development of executive function. So Bruce completed his PhD at the University of Toronto, did a postdoc in Denver. How'd you like Denver?
Fantastic.
So he's a professor in the Department of Psychology at Western, a full professor, and a principal investigator at the Brain and Mind Institute, and a core faculty member of the Graduate Neuroscience Program. He's also the director of the Cognitive Development and Neuroimaging Lab at Western. His research concerns, his research interests concern development of cognitive control and its associated with changes in prefrontal cortex function. I think this is relevant to all of us. I think that many of the kids we see certainly have huge problems with executive functioning and minimal brain dysfunction, and part of the brain. So, Dr. Morton.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, so thank you very much for coming. And it's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to be talking about some new things that we're working on in the lab. So it's not a lot of data, just a lot of new avenues that are born out of some methodological innovations we've been working on. So I very much look forward to your comments and feedback and things like that. So all right. Whoops. Somehow I have lost control over my PowerPoint slides here.
I think it's the group anonymous, I think is.
Yeah, normally it should just work with, here we go. Okay, I'll try this way. So executive functioning is probably a concept that's familiar to you all. It refers to a set of processes that are important for remaining focused in terms of our ongoing intellectual activities, and yet at the same time affords us some flexibility. So if we have to kind of change things up, fortunately we have executive functioning on hand that contributes flexibility. It's a multi-dimensional construct. So by that, I simply mean that the consensus view amongst those who study executive functioning is that it's not one thing, but it represents a set of underlying processes. Of course, there's no consensus on what those processes are, but for instance, one influential taxonomy of Akira Miyake's stipulates that there are 3 underlying factors: working memory, flexibility, and inhibitory control. So it's not one thing, it's a multiple of things. And these processes are related in ways that we continue to try and understand to a distributed cortical and subcortical brain network. So in this diagram here, or this image here, is an image of what's was referred to in 2007, at least, as the cognitive control network. This is a paper by Walt Schneider. The cognitive control network encompasses regions such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but it extends into other areas of frontal cortex, like the dorsal premotor cortex and the inferior frontal junction, the anterior insular cortex, and then more posteriorly the parietal cortex along the medial surface, cingulate cortex, and then subcortically into the basal ganglia. So this is a concept which is it's critically important, I think, for understanding many different aspects of development. So one thing that we do know about the development of executive functioning is that it follows a very protracted trajectory. In other words, it gradually develops through childhood, adolescence, and into early adulthood. And individual differences in executive control early in development are a robust predictor of a variety of important outcome variables or measures, such as social adjustment, academic achievements, a variety of health-related behaviors. So understanding sources of individual variability early in development is important, both for diagnostic and prognostic reasons. Kind of going hand in hand with the idea that there's considerable inter-individual variability in executive control at a particular age, early in development, children follow varied trajectories. So some children advance very quickly on certain domains of executive functioning, and the converse may be true for other children. And this variability, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally, derives in part from the fact that there are many different factors that contribute to the development of executive functioning. So there's genetic factors, so heritability estimates for aspects of executive functioning are moderate. And in addition to that, there's a whole catalog of different experiences that also contribute to variability in executive functioning in early life. And one could also imagine that there's going to be an interaction of genetic and experiential factors for promoting variability early in development and executive control. So, needless to say, there are many, many different instances where we, as professionals that are interested in the psychology of young children, are confronted with the question, well, like, what's going on with executive functioning in this child? Sometimes that happens in an assessment context where we might be asked to consider the possibility that a child has difficulties in self-regulation and executive control. Certainly in a research context, these questions garner considerable attention, where, for instance, we might be asked what mechanisms contribute to developmental changes in cognitive control, where those mechanisms might be specified at a cognitive level or in terms of neurophysiological processes that are occurring in tandem with changes in intellectual development. So there's a whole raft of different research enterprises based on an interest in cognitive control or executive functioning early in development. And certainly in the context of intervention and evaluation, both in a clinical and educational context, we're constantly asked whether there's a way in which we could help to remediate difficulties remaining focused in the class or staying still when the teacher is talking and so on. And clearly we want to be able to evaluate the efficacy of those interventions as well. So there's a variety of different settings in which we are asked to speak to the status of executive functioning in the children. And this, of course, raises a question about how do we actually go about conceptualizing and measuring cognitive control, especially in these groups. Now, needless to say, we're not without measurement instruments at our disposal. And so one approach to doing this is to rely on survey instruments, and these would be typically administered to parents or to teachers. And they would be, the parents or teachers are then asked a series of questions about their children's self-regulatory behaviors in a variety of different contexts. And then based on the profile of the parents' responses, we can then generate a clinical report or an assessment of that child's executive functioning. And the nice thing about this particular instrument I'm talking about here, which is the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Functioning, or BRIEF for short, is that in line with the idea that executive functioning is a multidimensional construct, the BRIEF will give you an evaluation of the child's executive functioning on a number of different domains. And so, you know, here, these are sort of these summary domains. So you get behavioral regulation index, emotion regulation index, a cognitive regulation index, and then a general regulation index. And because this instrument has been normed, you not only get a raw score, but then you can express that raw score in terms of a score that's typical for a child the age of which, you know, was the target of the survey here. And then you can chart this on this kind of report sheet and see in relation to the norms where how that child sort of fits into the picture, right? So this is a useful means of characterizing executive functioning in a child. And it's particularly useful in an assessment context, but one could also imagine extending the utilization of this instrument into a research context. So for instance, if we were doing a neuroimaging study of young children and we had acquired some imaging data that allowed us to characterize the functioning of different networks that we suspected were involved in executive control, we might be able to relate connectivity in those different networks to that individual child's score or a sample of children's score on different dimensions of the brief. Similarly, in the context of work on intervention and evaluation, we might be able to administer the brief prior to administration of some sort of intervention. We then administer the intervention, and then after the intervention, administer the brief again and see whether or not there's any pre-post change in the parents' assessment of their child's executive functioning across different domains. So clearly, surveys have some general utility here. The major drawback, though, is that what we're actually getting is a parent's description of the child's behavior, right? So for an assessment context, we may be able to overlook those shortcomings, but certainly in a research context where we're actually interested in mechanisms, be they cognitive or neurophysiological, that are underlying either the generation of individual differences at a particular age or that are contributing to advances in cognitive control over time, parental reports are not going to give us a lot of traction on executive functioning as it's actually occurring in the individual child that we're interested in. And then certainly in the context of intervention and evaluation, it would be nice if our intervention borrowed some of the materials that we're also potentially using for the purpose of evaluation. So here we've got a survey instrument that allows us to perhaps evaluate the intervention, but the survey instrument itself doesn't provide us with a means of developing some sort of an intervention. It's just something that we can use to evaluate the efficacy of that intervention. So there's pluses and minuses here with survey instruments such as the brief. So in addition to surveys then, there has been a whole catalog of different tasks that have been developed over the years for studying executive functioning in children. And one that's particularly useful in the context of assessment is one called the NEPSI, which is short for the Developmental Neuropsychological Assessment Battery. So here's a picture of that battery that I just clipped off from the website of the company that distributes this instrument. And the NEPSI, when it's administered in its full format, which takes something like about 90 odd minutes, it will give you a comprehensive assessment of children's cognitive functioning across domains that sort of divide along sort of neuropsychological families. So we get visual, spatial abilities, social perception, sensory motor capacities, memory and learning, and language, and then a separate domain in executive functioning, where within the executive functioning domain, there are 6 tasks that are given to the child and then provide a basis for evaluating that child's executive functioning. And some of these are sorting tasks, so an animal sorting task where the participant has to categorize images in different ways and then switch the categorization. Auditory attention, where the child is provided with an auditory stream and they need to depress a button when they hear a particular target word, and then they not depress a button to lures or distractors. Clocks is basically just what it is. Somehow this is an executive functioning test. The child has to then provide in a form of an analog clock diagram what a particular time is. Design fluency, the child is given a constellation of dots and then has to show how many different designs can be drawn uniquely from the dots by connecting the dots in different ways. Statue is one where the child is told to stand still with their eyes closed for 90 seconds and resist interference from auditory distractors. And you're just basically looking to see whether the child can maintain that statue pose. And these tasks then, some of them can be used for children as young as 3 years of age, but most of these tasks are appropriate for kids around 7 to 16 years of age, okay? So there's, 5 to 6 different tests that can be administered as part of the NEPSI. And again, like the brief, that's going to provide you with a normed score, so you'll be able to compare that individual child's score on any one of those 5 or 6 tests that you've administered, compare that individual child's score with a norm for that particular age group, and then see whether or not they are scoring in an age-appropriate way, or they're advanced or delayed relative to their age cohort. In the research and intervention and evaluation context, there are a plethora of different tasks that have been developed to study executive functioning. I'm not going to go through this list exhaustively because even an enthusiast like me would find this awfully boring. But suffice to say that when approaching this from a research context, normally what we do in developing tasks for studying executive functioning in kids is we kind of start with a conceptual taxonomy like Miyake's, where we have, inhibition, working memory, and flexibility. And then we sort of operationalize those concepts with a task. So, for instance, we might sort of say, well, inhibition or selective attention, I think what we're getting at in this is sort of filtering out, irrelevant information and not responding to relevant information and responding only to the information that's relevant. So let's come up with a task such as this one called the Simon task, where the child is told, whenever you see a butterfly, depress a button that's located to the right-hand space for the child, right? And this is easy when the butterfly appears on the same side of the screen as the button that's to be depressed, but it's comparatively more difficult for the child to depress a button on the right side of space when the butterfly appears to the left. And this causes a certain degree of interference between the identity and the spatial location of the stimulus. This interference leads to a small cost in performance, which is measured in terms of what's called an interference effect. And that interference effect then can be used as a basis for evaluating whether the child is able to successfully filter out irrelevant information and withhold responses to that irrelevant information. For flexibility tasks, Phil Zalazzo, who's now at the University of Minnesota, developed a task called the dimensional change card sort task. Again, on the understanding that attention flexibility or mental flexibility is an important component of cognitive control. This is now part of the NIH toolbox, which is a set of tasks that can be administered to evaluate executive functioning in kids. And in this task, shown in this sort of pictorial diagram, children are given two trays that are each labeled with one of two target cards that differ along two dimensions. So they differ in terms of both their shape and in terms of their color. And then children are given these test cards, which they have to sort. So in pre-switch trials, the children might be told, okay, look, here's a rabbit. We're going to play the shape game, and in the shape game, we put the rabbits here and the boats here. So here's a rabbit. Where does that go in the shape game? And the child will sort that card correctly into the bin marked with the blue rabbit. Then after a series of these pre-switch trials, the child is told, okay, let's play a new game. Let's play the color game. And in the color game, the blue ones go here and the red ones go here. Look, here's a red one. Where does this card go in the color game? And what the child then needs to do, of course, is to reverse the categorization that they had applied in the pre-switch trials. And rather than sorting it into the bin marked with the blue rabbit, sort it into the bin marked with the red boat. And this is trivially easy for us to do, but for children between the ages of 3 and 5, this is an excruciatingly difficult task. And even for children older than 5, although they can sort correctly on the post-switch trials, you nevertheless observe a small cost in their performance, such that response times and accuracy will reflect greater effort on those switch trials as compared to trials where the rule has repeated, right? So there's a small cost to performance when the categorization rule switches. And again, you can use that cost in performance as a metric of executive functioning, or at least the flexibility part of executive functioning. And then we have tasks such as planning tasks, or the trails task. It's been around for years. You have a set of stimuli that can be grouped in a certain order, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the child's job is simply to trace using a pencil the path between the objects according to that ordering. The Tower of Hanoi, the child is given an apparatus with 3 tongs, I guess, and a set of donuts, and they have to sort of sort the donuts according to a picture that you've given them, and you're evaluating whether or not they can move the donuts into the correct position in the fewest number of moves. Okay. Anyway, I won't belabor this. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these things. And some of these tasks actually can be utilized for the purpose of intervention and evaluation. So you can take a card sorting task and continuously administer that to children and practice them up on mental flexibility or a working memory task or assignment interference task, and use that as a basis for, in a sense, practicing executive functioning, and then use a related task to evaluate whether or not continued practice has yielded a change or an improvement in their executive control, and then additional measures to see whether that generalizes outside of the context in which you're actually assessing executive functioning with a task. So tasks are useful. They allow us to ask targeted research questions, and we can actually utilize those tasks in developing intervention programs and evaluating those programs. But these particular tasks that I'm talking about have certain shortcomings as well in an assessment, research, and intervention and evaluation context. So one drawback of some of these tasks is that they are incredibly boring. Which isn't perhaps a problem when you are working as an experimentalist and the child understands that they've come into your lab and they're just going to do 10 minutes of this crazy task and then they get their stickers and they can go home. But if you're going to use one of these tasks for the purpose of an intervention, then the question about engagement and interest then becomes more important. And the thing is that if you're going to go to the trouble of putting a task on the computer, you know, it doesn't have to be boring, because there are many ways in which software developers have done a masterful job creating games for kids, which they will play to our dismay. Like, just please put that away. Like, stop playing with the computer. It's like, oh, I just got to get to the next level. Please let me play one more time. Right? So if we're going to go to the trouble of computerizing something, it doesn't have to be boring like the Simon task, right? The other thing, another consideration is that carrying around all sorts of stuff, if we're going to be doing research in the schools or whatever, it can be terribly impractical. So as an illustration, you probably all know Dwayne Johnson, right? Because what you do know about Dwayne Johnson, Man of the Century, is that he's appeared in some of our all-time favorite Hollywood movies, like Baywatch and San Andreas, right? What you probably do not know about Dwayne Johnson, though, is that prior to his career as a Hollywood actor, he actually worked as a research assistant for a developmental psychologist. And if you don't believe me, here's a picture of Dwayne Johnson showing up at a preschool carrying all the gear that the psychologist needed to do the testing, right? So I had to tell one of my students that this was actually a joke. So, so he wasn't actually a research assistant before his career as a movie actor. But joking aside, one of the things that we are working on in my lab right now is an international study looking at executive functioning development in children from very different parts of the world. So we're studying children in London, Ontario, and we're comparing the development of executive functioning for kids in southwestern Ontario with children in Lebanon and children in China, right? So logistically, in terms of getting gear over to these different parts of the world, materials and such translated for use with Arabic speaking or Chinese children, Chinese speaking children, getting research assistants trained so that we can get convergence in terms of the administration of the protocol across very different sites, it becomes, I wouldn't say impossible, but it becomes quite difficult, right? Just because of all the various variables that are at play in terms of administering a set of tasks, you know, that involve different materials and so on and so forth. Another thing that I'm working on as well is advising the Marymount Family Crisis Center on the development of an intake protocol. They've opted to use survey instruments, which is fine, and that's a perfectly decent way to go. But if you wanted to use tasks for kids, you know, pulling out the NEPSI when the child is in crisis and trying to administer that during an intake interview, it's just not going to be feasible, right? It's pushing. It's kind of pushing the child to their limits. So again, it would be great to have a task-based measurement for these kind of contexts, but the NEPSI certainly isn't going to work, and certainly the Simon task isn't going to work. Like, I'm really sorry about the difficulties you're having in your family, but if you could just do this incredibly boring task for me for 15 minutes, I would be massively appreciative.
Have you actually tried doing that?
No. Again, the research that I do at the university, we want to combine the administration of these tasks with other forms of measurement, such as fMRI. So we want to be able to have a task that's computerized and that's amenable to administration in a variety of different kinds of contexts, right? So again, it's sort of an added constraint. I won't spell it out for you. I think you get the idea that some of these tasks are impractical for these various applications. Here's a more important concern, though, and that is going back to the idea that executive functioning is a multidimensional construct, right? So the idea, again, is that executive functioning isn't one thing, but it's a variety of different processes. Okay, so if we buy this idea, we take it seriously, the implication is, though, that any single task that we administer to a child is not going to be process pure. It's not as though we can say, okay, well, in our executive functioning taxonomy, flexibility is a core process. Therefore, I'm going to take the card sort task, and that will give me a measure of flexibility. Well, it's true, card sorting does involve flexible categorization, but it also requires that the child keep the rules of the task in mind. So there's a certain degree to which the task is going to require some working memory. The child needs to selectively attend to, for instance, color, whereas before they had been told that shape was relevant. So on those switch trials, they're also selectively attending to one feature of the stimulus and ignoring something that they had previously been told was relevant. So there's a degree of selective attention. There's a degree of response selection. The child has two options. Which of these two bins am I going to put the card in? And then moreover, once they have sorted the card, they're probably going to sit there and think, well, did I do this right? They're going to look at what they've done and compare it against what they think they were supposed to do. And they're going to be monitoring their performance, right? These are all different facets of executive functioning that come into play. So if we look at any individual task, and I tried to draw this out in a conceptually sensible way. I don't know how much this makes sense to anybody other than me. But if we imagine that the executive functioning is comprised of different underlying processes, we can imagine that tasks such as the card sort or trails or the Simon task, the performance in that task is, in a sense, it's a sum of weighted contributions of those different processes to performance. It's not a pure measure of any one of those individual processes, right? So what we want to do then in thinking about executive functioning in kids is we want to think about these underlying processes, right? And we have to acknowledge then that any single task is not going to purely assess any one of those processes. It's necessarily going to be a combination of processes that's involved in performance. Some tasks are going to draw on some processes more than other tasks, but all tasks are going to be an amalgamation of different processes. To get around this problem, then, what we need to do is we need to administer a battery of tasks. This is what Akira Miyake and others have done. You administer a battery of tasks, and then you look at the factor structure underlying performance of the battery of tasks. And in that way, you can begin to examine the component structure or the factor structure underlying the different facets of executive function. And the problem is that if we go back to, for instance, to the NEPSI, in the utilization of any of those tasks, the tasks themselves are evaluated individually. We've got this card sorting task, we've got statue, or we've got these other things. Each of those tasks is taken as a pure measure of something, although we don't actually know what it is, right? It's great for assessment because it's got norms, but in terms of the measurement of executive functioning, we don't actually know what any one of those tasks is actually measuring. And the same concern is applied to tasks that are used in a research context and in an intervention and evaluation context. So if we choose to study card sorting, or we choose to use card sorting for the purpose of intervention, that's great, but we're still just studying a task. And that task is in a whole amalgamation of different things. So if we want to get at executive functioning, we've got to kind of unwed ourselves from single tasks and begin to try and think about batteries and underlying component structure. Okay, So these are the challenges. And so what I want to do in the time that I have remaining is just talk a little bit about things that we're working on in my lab to try and address these challenges. And the first thing that we've done is we've developed what we call an executive functioning game suite. So the basic idea here, and this is a geomorphological analogy here, we're not building planets. The idea is that we start with a task. So we might start with card sorting. We might start with something like a digit span. You know, here's a couple of numbers, wait a couple of seconds, and then tell me what those numbers are. So we take a basic task. And then that task is then instantiated in HTML because as a language, it's a language that can be rendered in any number of different platforms, from laptops to desktop computers to handheld telephone phones, tablets, and so on. So it's a nice universal language. We then take that and we come up with a child-friendly narrative, right? So instead of saying, this is a digit span task, I'm going to write you 3 numbers and I want you to remember them for 2 seconds and then repeat them back to me. We come up with a game like, you know, you're going to be doing spy training right now, and well, I'll show you in a second what we do with the digit span. We come up with a child-friendly narrative that turns the game, the task, into something that's an interesting or potentially fun game. And then we use some graphics to kind of make this a plausible scenario for kids, right? And so at the end of that, we end up with a computer game, effectively, which, I mean, if it works out well, it's engaging. I'm not sure it's quite fun, but it's engaging. They're relatively short, 2 to 3 minutes. We can have the difficulty of the task increment up through a number of levels, so starting at an easy level and then increment up so that we kind of find the child's ceiling in incremental steps. It's platform independent. In other words, we can use it across a variety of different computer environments. And at the end of the day, it yields a behavioral measure, a reliable behavioral measure. In other words, test-retest reliability, right? And this is work that I'm doing in collaboration with a friend of mine at Imperial College in London, England, the other London. So what we do then on the battery ideas, we come with a whole variety of these different tasks. So we've now got like a set of 8, for instance, of these tasks. Actually, we altogether, I think we now have 13. But we have a whole battery of these tasks, and of course, then this gives us the possibility then of looking at the underlying factor structure, underlying variability and performance. So we can kind of get at this idea that executive functioning is this multidimensional construct. So I would I'd show you what this looks like, but I'm going to do that. Wait in a second, because if I switch out of this view now, it's going to mess up the thing. So we'll take a look in a second at what it looks like. I've got one here. So going back to our table, then we've got an executive functioning game suite as another possibility, and for research purposes, we've got a battery of tasks where the tasks themselves are engaging, relatively easy for the children to understand, and that allows us to begin to model the factor structure underlying executive functioning at different ages. Okay, but if we wanted to, for instance, if we're talking about taking this battery on the road and administering it to kids in different parts of the world where we don't necessarily have access to the internet, and we have to be concerned about data security issues. So for instance, if we give somebody a computer to go and collect data, and in addition to collecting the battery data, they're collecting sensitive demographic or other kinds of clinically relevant information, we want to make sure that on the way home on the bus, if the RA happens to lose the device, that we haven't breached some concern about confidentiality, and so on. And then the other thing is we want to also make sure that that the kids are set up on the devices in similar ways. So if we're thinking about comparing children in China with children in SIDA in Lebanon, it's conceivable that the computers that children might be using in China might be very different than the computers that children are using in Lebanon. And so if we get a nation effect, maybe it's just because the computers were easier ergonomically for the children to interact with in China than they were in Lebanon, for instance, right? So we have a variety of these other concerns. So then what we've come up with is this, this handy dandy device here, which is our portable measurement device system. Basically the way this guy works, the software for this device was developed by a research scientist or data scientist in my lab. So there's an example of the device here. And so I'm sorry, I'm just divided in my mind. What I'll do now is I'll just show you what these games look like, just so you have a sense. So this is an example of the digit span game. We call it spy training, right? It's effectively like a digit span task. Children are told that they're learning to become a spy, and as a spy, they're going to be given secret codes, which are going to be sent to them on their smartwatch. And so what they need to learn to do is just wait for the information to come in from headquarters, remember that, and then input the information into their the little button thing here, right? So it starts at 2, so it's relatively easy at the outset. The smartwatch comes on, they get 2 numbers, 3 and 2, and then they just press that right into the keyboard here. And then at that point, they graduate up to the next level, which is 3 numbers. And you kind of get 3 tries at each level until at, say, 5, the child no longer can remember the sequence, and then the game ends. And then you just basically would go on to the next game in the series. And all of the games here can be accessed to this little panel at the top. So this just illustrates the idea that we've taken a core task like a digit span task. We've come up with a child-friendly narrative to make this a little bit more entertaining, and then use graphics to kind of instantiate that narrative. And then when the task is administered, then the browser, in this case Firefox, basically just generates a data file which then can be stored locally on this device, right? So that's the basic concept of the HTML games. But then what we've done with these devices is we've engineered them in such a way as the browser here can actually store the data locally, and as it's being stored, the data is encrypted. And so even if the data is not transferred back to the lab, anything that has been collected during the day is on the local drive in a format that is unreadable by somebody who could steal that computer, right? When the device then is connected to the internet, those data files then are instantly sent back to our server, and then they're compiled and then decrypted, right? So that's very convenient because all of the data that we've collected in China and so on and so forth is now sitting on our server in Canada. The other thing is that because of the way that we've developed this, we can also modify the setup of the protocol, the experimental protocol on the device from Canada. So we can push updates. So if there's a spelling mistake, or the children don't want to do a task in a particular order, we can introduce modifications to the devices from anywhere in the world when the devices are hooked up to the internet, right? So again, we can collect data in the absence of an internet connection because the data is stored in an encrypted format, and then once it's connected to a wireless network, the data is transferred back securely to our server. And because we're using the same devices across all of our measurement sites, we don't have to worry that we end up with the children in China doing differently than the children in Lebanon because they're using different computers, right? And here's just a couple of pictures. I was in China at the end of last year overseeing data collection, and in the space of 3 weeks, we collected data from 350 kids in Shanghai. It was great. So it works really nicely. So one of the things that we're working on right now is just translating all of the materials into multiple languages so that we can have multiple versions that will be usable in different countries around the world. Having this supported in a web-based way so that, for certain experiments and certain applications, it's nice to have the portable devices. In other cases, it would be nice if the users could just log in to a web hosted system and administer the battery from a web application. So we're also working towards having this instantiated in a web-based application that will support multiple studies. So if we have a study going on in China and another one here in Canada, we could have multiple studies being conducted in tandem from the same server. Okay, so there's certain advantages and advantages. I kind of put a double plus there just to sort of toot my own horn. What about assessment? Well, right, so that's a work in progress. And I don't purport to say that this is an executive functioning measure and that you should go and use it to evaluate kids. But what we're working on as a first step with this, because one of the things that we do ultimately want to do is say, this is a reliable and valid measure of executive functioning that has great utility and use with kids. So what we're going to do is we expand the battery out. We'll include maybe 12 or 15 different 2 to 3 minute measures, administer that to kids, and then have the parents of those kids complete the brief, right? And then we will look to see what combination of tasks that we've administered to kids best approximates a profile of executive functioning that has been provided by the parent. Again, not perhaps the best way to do validation, because there's nothing necessarily sacrosanct about the brief, but at least we could say, well, we have a subset of tasks that actually maps quite well onto the brief, and so we're comfortable calling this a measure of executive functioning, right? So that's in progress. Another thing that I'm very excited about is the possibilities for intervention and evaluation. So these are ideas that my colleague Adam is developing for use with aging patients and patients with traumatic brain injury. So we've gone over the idea that there might be multiple of control processes that are engaged differentially by tasks on this device, with the data being sent back to the file server. But what Adam is trying to do, or is working on, is developing software on the server that can compile all the data across a whole catalog of different participants and situate that individual score relative to all the various patients that he's got data on. And then that way, these might be aging patients, patients with traumatic brain injury, but based on that individual's profile of strengths and weaknesses, then the server then can dynamically prescribe, selected tasks from the battery. So if the individual, say, shows fine working memory and inhibitory control, if that's what the underlying factor structure is, but they're having challenges with flexibility, then the server will know to send out to the patient who has a device like this, their daily exercise in flexibility or whatever. The point is that you can dynamically tailor the intervention to the dynamically changing strengths and weaknesses of the individual in question, right? So it's this notion of a smart server, which is possible, again, if you kind of tie all the pieces of the puzzle here together. So, but again, this is just all blue sky at this point. But in any case, it gives you an idea about some of the things that we're working on. And the other thing that I would like to emphasize in this too is that having a set of software that like the one I showed you here, gives rise to the possibility of synergizing across all three domains: assessment, research, intervention, and evaluation. Because we could use, with the same set of measures, once we figure out what combination of measures we need to use, once we've got that, we can continue in our research enterprise to understand the involvement of different brain networks in the performance of these tasks. And we can also utilize the same insights to inform the use of that battery for the purpose of assessment and for the purpose of intervention. So it gives rise to the possibility of synergizing across all three of these sort of domains or columns in this table, right? Okay, anyways, I want to thank you very much for your time. Always a pleasure to see you, Rob. Thank you very much for the invitation. Just a shout out to the many people who've been involved in this. and to the funding agencies who make this research possible. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Priscilla. It was actually a great review of the questions.
I'm just wondering how you found children-friendly narratives that were like relevant across cultures. Like, I'm just wondering how the spy narrative would have went over in China and
Right.
North Korea in particular.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's tricky, and I don't profess to say that we've ironed out all the details there yet. Teaching the children to be spies is probably maybe not the best choice, but we try to present it in relatively innocuous ways. The narrative, of course, can be changed relatively easy without changing the visual graphics. So we haven't settled on any particular narrative yet, and I'm open to dialoguing with with people to kind of settle on what's an appropriate set of narratives. But some of them are things like, for instance, we have another game where it's we have a piece of cheese. It's a spatial working memory task, so you have to remember a bunch of different locations. And so it's like there's a bunch of mice hiding in the cheese, and you're a cat, and you have to look for the mice. So my daughter wouldn't like that one because she doesn't like killing things. But most kids are sort of familiar with the idea of mice and cats and cheese. Another one is, a hotel where you have guests staying at a hotel and you have to kind of remember what rooms the guests stayed in. Again, relatively innocuous. We have these kinds of things, right? So there's a number of issues there too, because like some of the things that I think would be really fun, like I came up with this game of like a bug squishing game where we could squish bugs, which I thought was great, but like it wasn't that popular with like my daughter thought it was just disgusting and she didn't want to have anything to do with it, so we kind of abandoned the bug squishing narrative. So yeah, we've tried to come up with things that are innocuous, but I'm not sure we've come up with things that are completely like bulletproof.
So when you say you're child friendly, were kids actually involved in developing them?
Yeah. So I mean, not extensively. It's not like I organized user groups or anything like that.
I don't think a user group of 4-year-olds would be easy for that.
No. But no, I mean. What we're looking at is we're trying to come up with something that's innocuous, like cats, mice, and cheese. That's relatively transparent, that's relatively universal, but it's not kind of like austere, like this digit span task. I want you to remember these 3 numbers for 1.5 seconds. So yeah. So we haven't actually, we've asked kids, because we're developing these in tandem, but normally what we do is we come up with an idea, instantiate it, and then look to see whether or not it needs to be modified in the interest of transparency. More than anything
I would also
else.
worry about different ages too. So I don't know if a 14-year-old wants to pretend they're being a spy. I don't know what they would count. But I don't even know how you'd be able to develop different things and validate them against each other.
Yeah. What we found with the work that we've done, most of the work we've done with this set of tests is with kids between the ages of 10 and 12. Most of them, the narrative is useful for explaining what the task consists of. And then once they kind of go, oh, I get this, it just becomes a task. Like for them, it's like, okay, now I just have to remember 5 numbers instead of 4. Oh, now I got to remember 6. And then it becomes, I wonder how high I can go. As opposed to like, am I going to be the best spy in the world, right?
But I do wonder if the narrative might change a child's response and ability. So if you're interested in being a spy, you might do better on the task.
Presumably, yeah.
So would you look at that? Just different narratives for the same task.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, what it sounds like to me? It sounds like a great like thesis project, really, is that one could do in collaboration, say with, an English scholar that had an interest in developing cognitive tests for kids, right? So you could imagine somebody coming up with a bunch of different narratives that could be used with a fixed set of graphics. That's the other variable in this too, right? Is because the graphics are not as flexible as the narratives. I mean, we could go back and redo the graphics, but that would be a much more time-consuming and expensive enterprise than changing the narrative. The narrative is really meant, I think, more as a way of presenting the task in a transparent way and somewhat more engaging way than just describing the task as like in a cognitive sense. So, but no, it's certainly an interesting question. My hope is that it just kind of gets kids over the hump. Like, do I really want to do this? Oh, actually, this doesn't seem as bad. Like last time I hung out with a psychologist, it was boring, right? Yeah.
Well, so I'm one of the few moved into the interactive world, right? So doing all my testing on the tablets.
Right.
I find it's the same risk, but there's more buy-in, right? Just because it's the tablet, because it's more, I can touch, I can see, I can do, right? So
But does that affect, have people done pre-test reliability with that? It'd be hard to do, because I wonder if people buy it or more, do they actually do better?
the outcome on the scores, the correlations are very, very high. So they had to be newly ignored. Yeah. So well, they did.
Okay.
Like some of the early work was actually just even raw score reliability. The coefficients are well in the 90s on that. So
That's what I was wondering with this, with the data span, that in presenting it in that more exciting way, do people score differently than if they just were given data span directly?
Right, and if there was there's two ways to look at this. I mean, from an assessment standpoint, you would be concerned if there was a discrepancy between the standard and the digital administration of the task. As an experimenter, I would actually find that quite exciting because it would potentially raise the possibility that the proficiencies of my children actually kind of are a little bit ahead of what my evaluation of them is, because I'm giving them tasks that they don't find particularly interesting and engaging. And Piaget, suffered greatly because of that. He gave them all these complicated tasks that had, very, confusing instructions. And sure enough, kids 6 and 7 years of age didn't get them until they were like 9 and 10. But then many psychologists after Piaget passed away went back and sort of said, well, conceptually, there's really no reason why a 7-year-old could not figure this out. What we need to do is just present the problem in a way that makes sense to kids. And sure enough, there were a lot of things that Piaget said kids were simply not capable of doing. And kids showed those proficiencies much, much earlier in development. So I think you have to be careful, but I think it could work both ways. If there is a difference, good. If there isn't a difference, good, right?
Because I was also wondering, like when you said it, I don't know how many clinical populations are using that. But I can think of somebody maybe with ADHD who may, because it's not as boring a task, maybe be able to focus longer, may do better. I don't know if anybody's done that work.
yeah, and I mean, I guess I can almost think anecdotally, that's probably the one group that has the greatest benefit for, especially some of the processing speed tasks where you're going from a paper and pencil to a dynamic visual presentation to go through. But again, I still wonder too about, but they are capable of doing it with the right condition. And that's where I'll take a look at something like a brief and compare and contrast. So what I like with brief is it's what other people see, not necessarily what the other kid can do, but that's an entirely valid question.
Yeah.
In its own right.
Yeah, right. And you're getting another set of eyes on the problem that you're studying through the lens
Yes.
of a computer task, right?
Yeah. So that was actually one of the things I was wondering, and for me, I think having a little bit of a computer background myself, the greatest excitement I have in some of the tablet-based stuff is getting at piece of measurement that would be very hard to do with a paper and pencil as a clinician. So looking at things like latency or adjustment or that, is that part of
Yes.
the game possible?
Yes. So the data are all acquired.
Yeah.
And the one reservation that I have, and the data are acquired, so it's there. One thing that I'm concerned about in terms of relying too much on latency measures, of course, is how the child is set up at the device. You want to make sure that the ergonomics is consistent across testing sessions.
Yeah.
otherwise, there's a whole lot of reasons why your latency measures are going to differ from one child to another.
I'd probably more interested in intra-child.
Yes.
So that less of a factor.
Right, but the same thing could apply, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like depending again on how you imagine this, like we might have a study where the kid comes into the lab at the university and they do the testing session on the tablet, and then we say, okay, well, go home and practice this at home, and then they're doing it on their home computer, and then they come back and we're measuring them on the tablet again. And so those are the situations where even inter-subject variability might be born out of device variability.
And I had that one too, actually, was the concern of the weakness of the cross-platform-ness of it. That watching that spy task, typing it on your tablet screen is going to be different than you're sitting at your keyboard. And
Correct.
doing the same thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So one of the reasons why when doing this international study, we invested in the development of the hardware for administering the battery, because with HTML, you can just host it in the cloud on a cloud server and just broadcast it from the cloud out to all these different research facilities, assuming that they had an internet connection.
Yeah.
But then I was concerned that, well, there's so much device variability there. I don't know what I'm going to get.
Yes.
But then once we committed to a particular device, then there was a whole bunch of other kind of engineering problems that had to be, overcome to get there, right? But it's one thing that we'll have to revisit as we sort of move forward with the software, certainly in terms of thinking about web-based administration of it, right?
Yeah.
Because then that device variability is going to rear its ugly head.
And I'm sure that's part of the reason why Pearson is locking down the iPads.
Right.
Right? Because there's a known unknownness to it.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
My question is, how much of a transfer effect did you see between the computer-based tasks, the actual real-world performance?
Yeah.
If you had some kind of a planning task, how much do the child actually, how much do the parents and the teachers see in terms of the ability to actually plan?
So I haven't done that research. What I was pointing out in terms of the intervention and evaluation part is that having a platform like this provides you not only with the means of developing an intervention strategy by selecting a game, say, and or a set of games, and then using that set of games to practice some facet of executive functioning, and then using another set of tasks to evaluate that. So it's possible. As to whether it would work, that's a whole other question, right? And there's a huge controversy in the literature right now as to whether or not executive functionings are actually amenable to practice. So, there are people like Adele Diamond, who is a Canada Research Chair out at the University of British Columbia, who believes firmly in the idea that executive functioning can be trained with everything from yoga to karate to learning the guitar to a whole bunch of other things. To other people who've done much more kind of so we say hardcore cognitive studies of this, and found that repeated working memory training effects have no effect on executive functioning, and well, even in age. So you have people like Torkel Klingberg, who espouses his particular working memory training as a means of improving working memory performance in kids. And the issue there is what are called the difference between near transfer and far transfer effects. So if you practice a certain working memory task, you're going to get better at that particular working memory task. But whether that has general benefits for other related executive functioning tasks, or whether tasks generally, you get better on all tasks, but whether that has any implications for self-regulated behavior in a more ecologically valid context is completely controversial.
My understanding is that Rosemary Canuck, with her Cantown program, found that kids improved on working memory tasks on computers, but in real life stuff, there was essentially no change whatsoever.
Right, exactly. So
for the other goals.
I mean, part of the improved performance may very well be that, you know, the particular game had an interesting narrative versus the real life task, where you have far less initiative to actually perform well because of the lack of
and so many more sources of variability too, right? Like, cause you've got like, you know, if you're imagining the arena where self-regulation becomes a challenge for kids, we're talking about, you know, busy environments where there's many, many different sources of distraction. They're variously aroused. There's different, you know, conditions of how well fed they are, how well rested they are. And in those more realistic arenas, one can imagine that just because you've, you know, reduced your Simon interference effect by 35 milliseconds because of 6 weeks of continued practice, that's going to have absolutely no impact on how well you're able to pay attention to the teacher when you're underfed and poorly rested and not on your meds.
Plus all the other executive functions besides just. Right, so you said it's multiple
Yeah, right.
things, it's not just one.
Right.
I think recess is a great place to test those things because it's loud, it's noisy, there's
Right.
lots of stuff going on.
Right,
It's a huge problem for kids that we see.
right.
Jim?
Just a quick comment. I think one of your colleagues, Don Soklovsky, once told me, he sits on the worldwide WISC data, right?
Yeah.
I think he once told me that the WISC factor analysis kind of looks the same the world around, except China.
Yeah.
Just ask him, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure why, but I have some thoughts, but I don't know what.
Yeah, that's a really.
He said that a long time ago, so I don't know if that's still holds.
No, and I've been meaning to contact Don because I just ran into him at the university the other day, and we wanted, and I actually, you know, I knew Don before, but I had no idea that he also works out of Beijing. So I've been meaning to sit down and chat with him, but I'll ask. That's another reason for me to email him.
The second thing I just wanted to say, my name is Jeff, I'm the lead psychologist here, and if any of your colleagues ever get to the point where they think they want to try to develop some clinical norms or studies, give me a call.
Oh, super. Yeah.
We have almost every diagnostic category. We have CPRI, access to a very large catchment areas. So,
And I was just saying, I mean, I think that because I assume you've done all the research on chemically developing kids so far.
well, you won't know if it's a random study.
Right, exactly. I mean, if it's a random sample, you know, like 5 to 10% right off the bat's going to be ADHD, right?
I can't say.
Well, that's not, so they're not
It's a
necessarily
class
chemically
of
developing.
kids.
But I think though that I would worry about, you know, kids with much lower intelligence, how do they do better or worse with things like the instead of digit spin, which requires some explanation. But would they do better if it was visually presented instead of explanatory? And same with language, with kids with language disorders, would they do better with visually explained stuff? And I think that's a great question.
Good question.
How much
You
of
can answer if you.
But yeah, I wonder with the list, how much is that an artifact of just not understanding the task sometimes? And that's an answerable, that's an critical question.
But one of the things, as Dr. Mitchell and I always talk about in the break shop, one of the things that is common in children at CPRI is just horrific executive functioning, working memory problems.
They're minimal brain disorder.
It's the core
Yes.
of the problems we see, right? Because we're constantly making poor planning and impulsive life circumstances.
Yeah, I would love to sit down and discuss that in more detail. That would be fantastic.
So given that, if you had to pick a commercial game that you thought might help someone's executive function, because our kids that we see here also spend a lot of time on games. So is there any resource or
Well,
anything
again,
that you could-
You know, the good news is there are a lot of addicted to Minecraft, which at least involves planning and organization.
yes,
So-
exactly. Spatial cognition.
but is there any evidence out there that in particular commercially available?
GTA is probably not the one.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, but then again, it always goes back to the crux of the matter is how do you evaluate the training effect? So if you're looking at Minecraft, and how does that, affect your reasoning about three-dimensional objects? I mean, my sense is you're going to get a huge training effect, right? Because there's so much in Minecraft that involves rotation and, reasoning about space and planning and various other kinds of things. But as you go further afield, to what extent is that practice going to generalize to something that would constitute a far transfer effect? So, you put the child in, in a classroom in industrial arts, that's what they called it when I went to school, an industrial arts classroom where they have to think about how to assemble a three-dimensional object out of wood and things like that. Like, I don't know whether, playing in a digital environment where your motoric interaction with the display is very different than your motoric interaction with materials like in an industrial arts classroom is, whether you're going to see those kind of far transfer effects. It's an interesting question, but not one I can answer.
So if you know Susan Gathercole, I remember her research correctly. Her conclusion, she tried to look at like marketed games. If I recall, she said what you're saying, which is that you do indeed get better at the game, but that doesn't transfer the skills. But she said the one factor that does seem to matter in terms of improvement is a levels game. So that as you get better, you are forced to a new level of difficulty, and then again and again. That those games show promise, whereas ones that you are just playing and mastering, and that's it, you're just repeating, and it doesn't bridge you to different ongoing. She said that seems to be the key, that there is a learning curve that's mapping your ability that's going up to actually getting you somewhere.
Yeah.
But I don't think she was showing a lot of real world.
Yeah. I mean, it depends, like, how do we assess the outcome, right? So are we looking at, like, when we think about helping kids do better at things, I think we need to also not only think about what it is we're trying, that we're form the basis of our intervention, but what are the kinds of skills that we're trying to shape at the outcome, right? And so going back to this notion of industrial arts, if what we're trying to do is help kids, become better masters of materials and various tools that they might use in the workshop, I can see how, experience with Minecraft might help you with a certain piece of the puzzle, but a lot of this is going to be motoric skills that require time on task in the context that you're building the skill of interest, right?
So there's a group on the West Coast, I can't remember their names, who are looking at fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is a group that I also see in the task in the game. If you wait, then you do better. So I think that's the core skill they're trying to get at, and they haven't finished their research, so I'll see what happens. But,
Right.
So I think it's things like that, but that isn't a commercial game. So I just always wonder, is there a commercial game where, if you wait for the fish to appear, you do better than if you just pick the first one. So
Right.
impulsivity is a common problem.
Yes. Yeah. So the nice thing again about this particular concept, and what I'm trying to talk about here is not a particular set of games that we're committed to using, right? But it's the concept of taking a core concept of a task. So for instance, if it's the case from the study out in British Columbia of children with fetal alcohol syndrome, that practice waiting 2 seconds before making a response is something that's going to have general benefits for their ability to meet everyday psychological challenges. Then one can imagine working with a software developer to come up with a game where children are rewarded for making responses where they have to wait 2 seconds or 3 seconds before making a response. And then at that point, it's just a matter of taking that, putting it on the system that we've engineered, and then making it available to somebody who wants to develop an intervention or an assessment tool, right?
Great. Well, Bruce, that was fantastic, actually. Thank you very much for
Yeah, no worries.
And thank you
Yeah,
everybody for coming.
thank you.